Well, good morning, everybody. Barry Jones with SP History, continuing on with our Malcolm X series. As I scroll through the source material, as I always do at the beginning of every presentation, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to all those who are commenting on the YouTube videos, on the YouTube channel. Uh, I think this is how we learn. We learn from each other. And I knew this being a 14-part series, and uh, that the early episodes might generate some confusion and or some controversy because that is the part of Malcolm X's life that is characterized by a lot of anger and hostility and revenge and hatred towards white people, et cetera, et cetera. And it could be misconstrued that that is who he was. And I've tried, if you've stuck with me this long, you know about the three dispensations. I've talked nonstop about the three dispensations and how he was on a journey, like all of us are. And that journey brought him to a place, a different place, whereby he was becoming an international juggernaut in an effort to unite and create brotherhood and advocate for human rights, not just civil rights. And that's when he became a threat. In other words, he was growing as a leader, as a person, et cetera, et cetera. And, uh, you know, this is necessary, I think, in order to tell the whole story. You've got to get the backstory. For example, just one little detail. When we find out that he is reaching out to Martin Luther King at some point later in his journey, it's important to understand just how significant that is because early in his career, he was very hostile to Martin Luther King. That shows the growth and his effort to unite people into a brotherhood, whereby to coalesce or form coalitions with people, even up to and including white people who he felt were sympathetic to the cause. Whereas before, early in his career, he was very exclusionary. These are just examples of the growth. So you have to start where he started and then work through his short 39-year life and tell the whole story. It's like what I do with JFK. When I talk about JFK, I stipulate that there were some things about his personal character that weren't very savory, right? And there were some people around him who thought they were actually doing the world a favor by getting rid of JFK. And to understand that perspective, you kind of have to walk a mile in their shoes and you have to explore a little bit JFK's shortcomings. It doesn't justify what they did, but it helps flesh out history a little bit. So that's, as a history teacher all my life, that's what I've tried to do is be balanced and bring both sides to the equation. A couple of months ago, I did a series on the Ukraine war, and I had to go back and give several episodes exclusively uh, detailing Vladimir Putin and his rise to power and what he had accomplished in Russia. It's a story that's never been told here in America. It's just, we've only heard the bad stuff about Vladimir Putin. Boy, I got a lot of blowback on that. But it helps flesh out and it helps us understand why this war in Ukraine is taking place and just the history of it. And it's not as cut and dry, it's not as black and white as people would make it out to be. There's a lot of nuance there. So uh, the problem is when I have to cut them into episode lengths, I try to keep it under an hour and a half. To do it all in one show, no one's going to watch a 3-hour show. Barely anybody watches 90 minutes. I don't know too many people who watch 90 minutes. So I have to break it up into different episodes, and people will come and they'll watch one episode and make a determination about where the series is going. Um, and so you get into Malcolm X, where it's 14 episodes long. If you don't watch all 14 episodes from beginning to end, including the lengthy ones and included in there, you really don't know where I'm going. I'm trying to present both sides, is my point. So anyway, thank you for the comments. We're learning from each other. And I know there's been several sources that I could add to this series that have been introduced to me through the comment section of the YouTube channel. So I appreciate that. Okay, today we're going, yesterday in episode 10, we were discussing the Raymond Wood story. And of course, the Raymond Wood story came straight from the mouth of a NYPD slash Bossy agent who was working for the FBI and infiltrating uh, Malcolm X's security detail and also compromising it by participating in a basically a hoax that was supposed to, it was a plot to blow up the Statue of Liberty, but really what it was a hoax that under which pretext you could arrest two of the three security agents that were going to be, our bodyguards that were going to be protecting Malcolm X on the day he was assassinated, get them out of the way, security stripping. And he tells his part in that story, which was to invite these people to this meeting, talk about the Statue of Liberty being blown up, laugh about it, cut up, and then 5 days before the assassination, arrest the two that were invited to the meeting. It was totally a hoax, but that's how you security strip. He also was able to shed some light on how many infiltrators were there on behalf of the FBI. He said there were 9 FBI informants there, in addition to himself and Gene Roberts. That's 11 total. And then, according to Mustafa Hassan, we found out there were multiple uh, plainclothes NYPD officers there as well. So many that the NYPD, when they showed up, the uniformed officers didn't know which was which. And they were asking each other as they were sorting through the crowd of witnesses, is this one of ours? Is he one of ours? Is she? So we find out that the Audubon Ballroom was completely infiltrated with an FBI presence, a bossy NYPD presence, and the bodyguards were completely stripped away so that Malcolm X was basically a dead man walking when he walked on that stage. So that's to introduce the second sort of the post-assassination investigation cover-up. We've already learned there was they screwed 2 guys, put them in jail for a bunch of years. New York finally exonerated them, released them, gave a bunch of money, and the main culprit gave them 4 names that they never investigated. And so we're trying to determine why they didn't investigate these 4 names, why they rushed to judgment on the 2 to protect the 4. And so today, what I want to talk about is the COINTELPRO uh, presence amongst Black civil rights groups. I haven't done a series on Fred Hampton yet. I plan to in the future because he's one of them. He's one of them that was infiltrated by COINTELPRO and he was assassinated. Martin Luther King is another one that was targeted by COINTELPRO and he was assassinated. Malcolm X is one of them, targeted by COINTELPRO and he was assassinated. It's interesting, Edgar Hoover, who's leading this whole COINTELPRO of the FBI, and in that memo, he says we got to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah. And he didn't have to say it. All you got to do is look what happened. And every time somebody rose to the level of possibly becoming a Black Messiah, they got assassinated. And all the fingerprints lead back to the FBI. In fact, of the 5 that were assassinated in the 60s that I've been focused on mainly, starting with Fred Hampton in 60, I think it was 61, JFK in 63, Malcolm X in 65, and then the 2 in 68, MLK and RFK. 3 of them, all 3 of the civil rights guys I just mentioned were taken out by the FBI. That's not a coincidence. Okay. No one else had a COINTEL program going. No one else had liaisons with the city police called Bossy that were infiltrating, surveilling, and trying to rat fuck these civil rights organizations from within. It was the FBI. The other 2 were taken out by the CIA, both Kennedy brothers. So this is what's going on in America in the 60s. So what I want to talk about today is the surveillance that was going on. It was the heavy surveillance that was going on as a result of the FBI and COINTELPRO acting on its leaders, Edgar Hoover's instructions. So we're just going to quickly go through this just to show you This goes back years. This didn't just start in 65. This goes back a ways. So we'll begin with this whole idea of a Black Messiah. And we're coming to the date of the memo when J. Edgar Hoover authors that memo, and he's the one responsible for the title Black Messiah. And it's interesting. I put this picture on here intentionally because both of these men were assassinated after they became uniters, where they were uniting civil rights groups together instead of fighting with each other and having all these intramural squabbles with each other. When they became threats is when they began to unite those. That was the whole fear J. Edgar Hoover had. Of course, in Malcolm X's case, he was uniting African countries with American civil rights groups. So his was even more widespread than Martin Luther King's. But at the time Malcolm X was assassinated, he was uniting these African countries and their leaders with the American civil rights movement in a human rights in an effort to advocate for human rights, which would include civil rights, of course. And it is one of the measures that he was undertaking was uh, a, uh, proposal to uh, charge the United States government with genocide at the UN. And of course, that would require a nation state to bring that kind of a charge at a body such as the UN. His relationship with these African leaders made that possible. And there were people in the American government just weren't going to let that happen. It would be too embarrassing. It would have been catastrophic for America's reputation, right? So that's when he became a threat. Martin Luther King became a threat when he launched the Poor People's Campaign, the March on Washington that followed up by the Poor People's Campaign, whereby uh, he was now uniting poor whites with poor blacks in an effort to stop the Vietnam War. And of course, there are going to be people in Washington that are going to oppose that because they were so in support of the war. So these were both reaching the position of a Black Messiah because they were uniting groups that previously were not united. Um, the According to Professor Manning Parable, the coming together now of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X was creating additional nightmares for the FBI because in 65, you start to see a merging of these two. So you have, in 65, you have the arrival of Malcolm X on the international stage. He's uniting foreign countries with the American Civil Rights Movement in an effort to create an international coalition of human rights advocacy. And now he's merging with the preeminent civil rights icon in America in the process. So this is double trouble for the FBI. Now, the first threat here is Malcolm X, clearly, because he's farther down the road in this coalition building than Martin Luther King is. Martin Luther King will get his, he'll become a threat as well. But the first threat in 65 was Malcolm X. But the fact that they were uh, laying aside past differences to come together uh, was clear, at least by the definition that J. Edgar Hoover gave in his memo, what a Black Messiah was. Anybody who could unite these disparate civil rights groups. That's what both of these guys fit that category. So I don't find it coincidental at all that they both end up assassinated. 3 years after Malcolm X's death is when J. Edgar Hoover authored this Black Messiah memo. Here it is. And it was the number 2 bullet item on that memo. And his instructions to his agency, to his organization, was to quote, to prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a Messiah. He's already been taken care of. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. Elijah Muhammad is less of a threat because of his age. We've talked about that before, and his health. He had poor health as well. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines, nonviolence, and embrace black nationalism. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way. So he's just laying it out. He's laying out who his targets are. Uh, and of course, in conclusion, at the bottom of the memo, he says, above all else, we must stop the rise of a single black messiah who can unite all black people in the United States. And it's not, again, coincidental. I don't believe in coincidences that 1 month after this memo was authored, MLK was assassinated. But, he says I find it interesting. Some people will say, well, that memo really doesn't pertain to Malcolm X because it was authored 3 years after Malcolm X's death. But doesn't mean in J. Edgar Hoover's mind that that thought process hadn't already occurred, that Malcolm X was rising to the level of a black messiah. He just hadn't put it on paper yet. But he himself says that Malcolm X might have been such a messiah, and now he's the martyr of such a movement. So he's clearly including Malcolm X in this black messiah uh, category. So that's not me putting it there. That's J. Edgar Hoover putting it there. Um, it's interesting that Malcolm X's new message of alliance and cooperation has actually isolated him from some of the friends that he had prior. You know, he's no longer welcome in the Nation of Islam. But that has given him a certain level of independence and freedom to become more dangerous to the American establishment. Also more dangerous to rival civil rights organizations because he can now reach out and form unity and brotherhood with people that before he was forbidden to do so. There were strict rules in the Nation of Islam about what organizations he could ally or reach out to. Part of uh, for example, he wasn't allowed to reach out to Martin Luther King because Nation of Islam and the leader, Elijah Muhammad, didn't agree with Martin Luther King. So that separation between the SCLC, Martin Luther King, and Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam was fixed as long as he was in the Nation of Islam. But now that he's not in the Nation of Islam, he's kind of a wild card. He's a free agent. He can make these alliances that previously he couldn't. He could also travel internationally, overseas. When he was in the Nation of Islam, he was the spokesman for the Nation of Islam here in America. So his expectation, he went where he was ordered and assigned to go. So he went all around in America. Now he can go to Africa, he can go to Mecca, he can go to the Middle East, he can go to all these different places and meet with these leaders like a traveling dignitary, a foreign diplomat, and reach out and form alliances with them as well. He's not bound by the Nation of Islam and or Elijah Muhammad. That makes him more dangerous, not just to the rival civil rights organizations, but also to the U.S. government, because he starts saying things that are embarrassing to the United States government, calling attention to the hypocrisy of the civil rights movement in America, the conditions of race relations, for example. He's also reaching out to socialist revolutionaries and socialist, allying himself with socialist revolutions. And of course, we're in the Cold War, and so we're against anything socialist and or communist. And so he's becoming a threat to the U.S. government in this embrace of socialist causes and socialist revolutions, which he says uh, one of the things that he's noticing is all these former countries that were under the thumb of colonial or imperial governments, or especially in Africa, are and in Latin America as well, are overthrowing their governments in these socialist revolutions. They're all socialist. And he starts to see a common thread. He says, seems to me the government that's more dangerous to civil rights and or human rights is capitalist and democracy, and the government that's more responsive to these concerns is socialist. So you can see in any number of ways he's becoming a threat to the United States government, attacking our system of government, democracy, attacking our economic model, capitalism, allying himself with socialist revolutionaries, revolutions, embarrassing America on the world stage, threatening to charge us with the United States government with genocide over its history of race relations. I mean, he's just becoming a threat. But none of that happens. Remember, when he was in the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad wouldn't even let him take the LAPD to task. So that's really the source, the whole Ronald Stokes thing. That's when the schism between him and the Nation of Islam started. So he was bound by limitations, and he was sort of in a prison. And when he was in the Nation of Islam, and now he's been let out of jail, and he's become a threat in the process. But according to Zach Kondo, historian, let's get into this COINTELPRO and how it worked and how long it's been operating. Not just against Malcolm X, okay? Don't get it confused. This is against all the black civil rights leaders. You saw the list. Stokely Carmichael was included, Elijah Muhammad was included, the Nation of Islam was included, Martin Luther King was included. The name you don't see on there is Fred Hampton. That happened prior, but he was included as well. And of course, um, Malcolm X is one of them as well. So Zach Kondo, historians, quote, the NYPD had a special unit that was actually modeled after the FBI. It was called the, quote, Red Squad. Its official title was BOSSI, the Bureau of Special Services and Investigations. They were like a miniature FBI that the FBI helped train. And they called it the Red Squad because their target, this is for public relations purposes, their targets were communists, right? Steve Fischler, who made the movie The Red Squad, he's a filmmaker, in his investigation, his research into this, Red Squad said, quote, they saw certain organizations as threats, and they wanted to destroy those organizations. Bossie saw a threat as anyone who was agitating for radical change, and they saw Malcolm as one of those threats. So, boy, that's a pretty broad definition. Anyone agitating for radical change, that's way beyond the category or the threshold of just being a communist. It could be anybody. Um, Tony Bowser, back to him. This is the detective with the NYPD who's part of Bossie, and he's explaining the relationship between Bossie, the NYPD, Bossie, and the FBI. So this is a guy on the inside. Remember, he's the guy who picked Gene Roberts to be the infiltrator, standing at the front part of the bodyguard troop that was supposedly protecting Malcolm X. He's the one that was picking these infiltrators. This was his daily assignment, Malcolm X. He followed him around everywhere, and they knew each other. He'll say so right here. He goes, I knew Malcolm. He knew that I was a member of Bossie. He knew that. He always called out, Lieutenant Bauza, how are you? He thought that the police department was monitoring him in a very obvious way, meaning wearing uniforms. I don't think he understood that we were tapping his wire and listening to the tapes. We cooperated with the FBI. We were intimate. They had our guy who was there, or they had a guy who was there every day going through our files and reports and giving them to his superiors. And this was in the age of J. Edgar Hoover, of all things. Awful man. And we were his handmaidens. So just like we see with JFK, the assassination there, where the CIA the mob used the Cubans to do their dirty work, just as we see in MLK, where the FBI used the Dixie Mafia to do its dirty work, just as we see in RFK, where they used Sirhan and Thane Eugene Caesar to do their dirty work. Here in Malcolm X's case, Tony Bauza is explaining to them, to anyone who will listen, that NYPD and its super secret Red Squad, or Bossie, was used by the FBI to do J. Edgar Hoover's dirty work. He continues on, practically every Saturday, I would go to 125th and 7th to hear him talk about Malcolm X. I studied him seriously because I considered him potentially a grave threat, a danger. I was a detective, a sergeant, and a lieutenant. We were monitoring what we thought were subversive activities, attending meetings, listening to speakers. That's really how we got involved with Malcolm. We thought he was a very capable, talented, dangerous man. We didn't know if he's going to break the law, but he had a lot of power. So he's just explaining the mindset. And of course, if you hear Tony Bowser talk, he doesn't really regret the fact that they felt that way about Malcolm X. They thought that was just pretty much, that was this job. And if it wasn't Malcolm X, it'd be somebody else. But Malcolm X was so out there, especially early on with his hatred for the white man. And now he's talking about socialism, the socialist revolutionaries, and he's talking down capitalism, and he's embarrassing the United States with these talks about racial uh, hypocrisy and he's talking about the extermination of the white race. This was early, and revenge, and it was just a lot of topics you could choose from because he was such a public figure to say, well, this guy could be a threat, especially as he rose through the ranks. And now, after he gets out of the Nation of Islam, instead of shrinking back into oblivion, he's exploded on the world stage. He's become even more dangerous. So you hear him talk, he doesn't express a lot of regret about that. He's like, we're just doing our job. Uh, so, but what he does express regret about is being used or allowing himself to be used by the FBI the way he was. And he realizes now, as his comment about how we were his handmaidens, it just sort of reveals what he thinks about the FBI and Edgar Hoover and how he was used in this whole case. This is another FBI agent, Arthur Fulton. Um, Actually, his name is Jerry Fulcher. We'll get to Arthur Fulton later. Jerry Fulcher was a detective. He was sort of similar to Tony Bowser in the sense he had all the same credentials: NYPD, detective, bossy, and he goes, I knew that Malcolm picked up phones on the second ring. I would listen to ring one and perfectly time it with ring two. He had two phones, and I just listened from 8 in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. That's what the position was. So he was one of these grunt guys for the bossy, listening on everything Malcolm X said on his phone calls. And this is further corroboration of what Tony Bowser said. He just didn't feel like Malcolm X knew exactly everything Bossy was up to. He thought they just had a uniformed presence at all of his events. He didn't realize the extent to which they had infiltrators. He knew there were infiltrators. He just didn't know the extent. Clearly, as one of his own bodyguards was one of these infiltrators, and he didn't know his phones were being tapped and recorded. Everything he said was being listened to. Although he did say in several public statements, Malcolm X did, that if you hang around with me, your phones are probably tapped because that's what they do to me. And he did acknowledge the fact that there were infiltrators. But so I think Malcolm X was a little bit more wise to what was going on than what Jerry Fulcher believes or Tony Bowser believes. But who could have anticipated that, for example, on the day he was assassinated, Malcolm X, there would be such a huge presence of NYPD, Bossy, and FBI officials infiltrated into that ballroom. I mean, maybe two or three, you think, but they had upwards of 20. So this, Malcolm X is clearly a priority by the time we get to 65, as far as the FBI is concerned. Zahir Ali, project manager of Columbia University's Malcolm X project, pictured here, said, quote, you could chronicle Malcolm's daily movements, the date, the place, the people, by going to the FBI files. The surveillance of Malcolm was so extensive. And that's what he's done. He's gone through the FBI files and cross-checked it with Malcolm X's uh, movements and realized that everywhere Malcolm X was, the FBI was, and vice versa. So they're just following him around. So when he went to these international trips, they went with him. According to these FBI documents, they first started investigating Malcolm in 1950. He's still in prison. You can see the document here. Uh, and it goes all the way back. And Now, this is a 63 document relating to events in 63, but while he was in prison, according to an examination of those documents, they were already looking at him. And then after he got out of prison and accepted into the Nation of Islam, the FBI began monitoring him. Now, initially, it was just because he was part of the Nation of Islam. Um, and of course, he comes from a, a family history of Marcus Garvey type people. His dad, you remember the story, what happened to his dad, his mom. So he has potential to be, one of these black separatists. But the real import is the fact that he's joined the Nation of Islam. And of course, they have already been surveilling the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. So now when he joins, he falls under the purview of everybody in the Nation of Islam being surveilled. It's not going to take long, though, for them to realize that he's a little different than the typical convert. The growth of this is according to Garrett Felber. I told you we'd eventually get to Garrett Felber, the historian, who, he's going to become really useful, his material, as we get into the uh, city of Newark and the mosque coming out of Newark and all its involvement in the assassination. Anyway, he said the growth of the Nation of Islam and the FBI surveillance of Malcolm X went hand in hand. Okay, so they're watching Nation of Islam, they're watching it grow. Of course, we've already discussed in earlier episodes that the man most responsible for that growth is Malcolm X, as he travels around the country speaking on behalf of Elijah Muhammad, gaining converts. Remember, it went from 10,000 to 40,000 and kept growing. It's because of Malcolm X. Hoover had a deep history of trying to subvert black radical movements and also a fear of what he later described as a black messiah. This fear that one singular figure was going to lead a revolution. And of course, the thing that solidifies in the mind of J. Edgar Hoover that he is a revolutionary is the fact that he's uniting and he's talking and he's allying himself with other revolutionaries around the world, some of them close to our shore, like Fidel Castro. And he's talking about revolution openly as he disparages capitalism and democracy. So, by every measure of the definition, Malcolm X came to represent that black messiah that J. Edgar Hoover feared so much. Peter Bailey said Brother Malcolm might have been that messiah, agreeing with J. Edgar Hoover, who could have unified and electrified the black nationalist organizations. He was in the process of doing it. The holdout was the Nation of Islam, who couldn't stand him. And that's what they did not want. When he says they, he's talking about J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. Al Sharpton, this is probably the one time in my life I'll ever quote Al Sharpton on anything, but I heard him discussing Malcolm X, and I thought his quote really represented the point I'm trying to get across, which is that he was becoming that black messiah. He said he was our shining black prince. FBI historian John Fox says, quote, the Bureau's investigation of Malcolm X really picked up in the early 60s as he became much more of a public figure because of his influence in bringing members into the Nation of Islam. The Bureau, much like much of America, was afraid that radical revolutionary violence was on the horizon, and they were very concerned that perhaps there would be a leader to rise to focus that anger, like Messiah, and they took it on themselves to look for ways to try to prevent that. This is a FBI historian acknowledging, okay, that his agency that he represents was looking for ways to try to prevent Malcolm X from becoming that black messiah, just like the memo in 68 would talk about. The FBI's worst fear was that he would activate this Fruits of Islam paramilitary organization, was part of the Nation of Islam. Here you see a picture of them. They have their own uniforms. They wear those hats, FOI. What they thought might happen, I'm talking about the FBI, is that Elijah Muhammad, as they surveilled him and the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, they began to get a more clear picture as to who was the real revolutionary in that batch. And it wasn't Elijah Muhammad. it was Malcolm X, but the fear was because of their close relationship early on that Malcolm X would influence Elijah Muhammad to activate the FOI and take to the streets, become more political. Remember, Elijah Muhammad resisted politics. Now, it wasn't altogether altruistic. It's because he's trying to protect his money and stuff. But if he, and the schism that eventually happens between uh, Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X was the fact that Malcolm X wanted to be more political and Elijah Muhammad didn't. They thought, well, eventually Malcolm X is going to wear him down and he's going to give in and become more political. And we're going to have this, it's not like we're dealing with marchers, like MLK's nonviolent marchers, kids and moms. These are young black men, a lot of them just recently released from prison, who are soldiers. They've been trained to be paramilitary soldiers. And this isn't just a cause they believe in. This is their religion. They'll die for this. And that's what really caused fear in white establishment, especially amongst the FBI, about the Nation of Islam. These other civil rights organizations didn't have paramilitary arms to them like the Nation of Islam did. And the fear was that along comes this revolutionary leader that's going to whip them up into a frenzy and we're going to have a problem. So the upshot of all this is that the FBI was determined to use COINTELPRO, which stands for counterintelligence techniques, to create distance and schisms. Remember, their whole purpose was to rat fuck. And I've used that word throughout. I mean, it goes all the way back to JFK, Watergate. Rat fucking is infiltration and divide and conquer from within. Just, just stir the pot and create a tempest in a teapot, so to speak. And so in this case, if they could create distance and schisms between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, then possibly you're weakening the Nation of Islam, number one, and you're lessening the risk or the chances that Malcolm's going to have that influence on Elijah Muhammad that they were so afraid of. So, according to witnesses, Muhammad himself complained about the Nation of Islam being honeycombed, that was the word he used, with enemies who wanted to destroy the movement from within. So Elijah Muhammad was wise to what was going on. Unfortunately, he still went along with it. He gets manipulated into this position where he's on the opposite side of the spectrum as Malcolm X, and he sort of gets maneuvered into this adversarial relationship, even though he understood that the FBI's tactics and strategies was to infiltrate and create these schisms. Um, Akbar Muhammad says whether they were working for the FBI or NYPD, the enemies of the Nation of Islam wanted to kill two birds with one stone. And it's, you got COINTELPRO targeting Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. If they're united, they're strong, and you have this two-headed beast you got to deal with. If you can create divisions, you weaken the organization, you weaken both of the men, and now you can target them separately. And of course, by the time we get to 68, when he writes that memo, Edgar Hoover even acknowledges the fact that Elijah Muhammad's not really worth the time anymore. He's so old and infirm. He's not really he doesn't fit the category of a Black Messiah. So by taking out Malcolm X, they essentially killed two birds with one stone. You think about, I'm going to go back to that point just a second. You think about what happened to the Nation of Islam, at least it's the perception of it immediately after Malcolm X's assassination. It ceased to be the organization that was rising so fast and becoming so prominent under Malcolm X. It was weakened. And now it was led by, instead of having this vibrant revolutionary firebrand, number two in command, who's probably going to be the successor, he's gone. He's literally gone. He's dead now. And now you have this aging, infirm leader who's been compromised any which way, financially, with all these babies he's having out of wedlock with these underage girls. He's been compromised. The damage is irreparable. And so That's what I mean by killing two birds with one stone. You take out the strong one, and the weak one falters on his own, in his own right. So the Nation of Islam ceased to be really a threat to the white establishment after the death of Malcolm X, even though he wasn't even a part of Nation of Islam at that time. There was always the chance he could go back, of reconciliation. According to David Garrow, who's an FBI expert that I draw from, the quote, the FBI had three human informants in the Nation of Islam who it regarded as, quote, top level. This is according to FBI documents. Top level, which means top level, informants. Now, you think about that, the leadership structure of the Nation of Islam was very small. So when the FBI says they have three top level informants, you're talking about a potential pool of individuals as less than 10 people. So if you had, let's say, nine, a third of them are FBI people, right? In the Nation of Islam leadership. Now, this is their own documented, they're acknowledging this in their own documents. So they have completely, just like Elijah Muhammad said, they've honeycombed the Nation of Islam leadership. And if you're Elijah Muhammad, you don't know who to listen to. You don't know if they're representing the Nation of Islam or the FBI. You know, even Junior Muhammad. One of the things that the surveillance revealed to the FBI, which later they're going to capitalize and manipulate, maneuver, push the right buttons, was that there was a growing rift or growing tensions between Elijah Muhammad, especially his family members like Junior here, and Malcolm X. And they saw opportunity in that. They said, man, we can manipulate this. We could exploit this. We could create this schism and get them fighting each other and take each other out. And just as evidence or proof of this, Junior Muhammad was quoted. Of course, this was caught on surveillance tape and recorded. Quote, you should cut out Malcolm X's tongue. I'll put it in an envelope, stamp it approved, and send it to my father. This is what he's saying. He is, this isn't just nobody. This is Junior Muhammad. This is Elijah Muhammad's son. He's the assistant supreme captain of the Nation of Islam, and he has become his father's spokesman or spokesperson. Now, Elijah Muhammad didn't say that. This is one of those people in the leadership, the small little leadership cohort that's advising Elijah Muhammad. It includes this guy, and this you can see what he thinks about Malcolm X. And this is what the FBI is picking up. They're like, "Ooh, I just see the wheels turning in their head." It's just like the CIA desperately wanted to assassinate Fidel Castro, right? But they found two willing partners that desperately wanted to assassinate Fidel Castro as well, the Cuban refugees in Miami and the mob. And they said, well, we'll feed you all the money and training and everything that you need. We'll give you the intel, blah, blah, blah. And you go take care of this for us. And they're button pushers. That's what the FBI is thinking. They're looking at this and saying, hey, Malcolm X is becoming a threat. But here is some people in the leadership in the Nation of Islam that they hate him worse than we do. And if we play our cards just right, push the right buttons, they can take him out for us. They're masters of this. The FBI, now knowing the hostilities and divisions within the Nation of Islam, because of all the surveillance and study, was able to incorporate counterintelligence techniques that help facilitate the Nation of Islam doing for the FBI what the FBI couldn't do for itself. This is according to Zach Kondo. He said, quote, the FBI thought if we keep pushing this thing, the nation will take out Malcolm X for us. This is what counterintelligence does. Included in counterintelligence is psychological warfare. That's part of it, where you play tricks on people's minds. You give misinformation or disinformation, and you feed it through the channel at just the right time to just the right people, and the result is almost predictable. You're just pushing buttons. That's all you're doing. And Zach Kondo continues, he says, quote, sometimes they would have agents to attend meetings. If white people were okay to be in it, then you could expect to see an agent. But if it's not, then they had informants. There was a distinction between informant and agent. An agent was an actual employee, somebody who worked for the FBI, like Tony Bauza, for example, but he was white. Um, or Jerry Fulcher or Arthur Fulcher. These are white guys, right? The informants are the ones that are going to feed you the information that you need. You got to get black people because these are black Muslim organizations. And so you turn people. And so then you have the agents who are working with the informants. The informants aren't necessarily FBI employees, but they might as well be. They're working for the FBI. But they're guys off the street that have been recruited to blend in and feed information. As we learned, there were 9 of them, according to FBI documents, in the Audubon Ballroom when he was killed. Now there were 2 agents. One of them was black, and he was part of the bodyguard, Gene Roberts, and then Raymond Wood was there. Tony Bowser was there, right? Or he was he wasn't there. I'm sorry, it was Raymond Wood. So there's a distinction between an informant and agent. It all goes to the purposes, what they're trying to achieve. Arthur Fulton was, I told you we'd get to him, he was 27 years old when he drew Malcolm X as his assignment in 1960. And in 60, remember, that's when all the surveillance of Malcolm X really ramped up. That's when they realized this guy is the real mover and shaker in the Nation of Islam. It's not Elijah Muhammad, it's Malcolm X. And the attention sort of shifted. He said, quote, there's 1,000 agents in New York City. And there was this one little squad run by a fellow named Ruckel that did black extremists. So I ended up on his squad. We called ourselves Ruckel's Raiders, you know. So I spent every day working Malcolm X. He says we ran spot surveillances, developed informants. We didn't have any black agents, so we had to go out and develop these informants. These were just black people we picked up on the street. We were all the time looking for somebody you thought you could use. Remember, when the schism starts to happen between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, such to the point where Elijah Muhammad essentially fired Malcolm X and said, well, you're suspended for 90 days. You're no longer the minister at Mosque number 7. The FBI, Tony Bowser, they went to his, it wasn't Tony Bowser, it was 2 other agents, but they went to his house and had an hour and a half meeting with him trying to recruit him to be one of these black informants. So he says, we were all the time looking for somebody you thought you could use. Not only us, but Bossy had their informants too. That's Tony Bowser. We would exchange information. So, you know, it's just, the Nation of Islam has just been infiltrated, honeycombed, like Elijah Muhammad said, the leadership and then the membership and the bodyguards. It's just been infiltrated. Abdur Rahman Muhammad is a historian, a journalist, a writer, and activist. Uh, I put this picture on here because he leads a class on the autobiography of Malcolm X. Uh, very informed, very good source there. He said, quote, there are documents in the FBI files that clearly establish FBI agents were tracking Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam, and Malcolm X. They knew all the secrets. The question is, what did they do with that information? I think we're going to learn what they did with it. David Garrow, back to him. He's that uh, Pulitzer Prize author and historian who is an expert in all things FBI, mainly the COINTELPRO operations, uh, the rat fucking of the 60s and the 70s of these black groups. He says, quote, I think many people would imagine that the most wiretapped person by Hoover's FBI was Martin Luther King. Well, no. The person who was most electronically surveilled by Hoover's FBI was Elijah Muhammad. The FBI was listening to Muhammad and his top aides 24 hours a day. This speaks very explicitly how important Hoover's FBI thought the Nation of Islam was. They were so concerned about the Nation of Islam because of its paramilitary arm, the FOI, the Fruits of Islam. And, the SCLC did not have that equivalent. They did not have a paramilitary trained army. They went on marches with women and children. So as far as which of the two could create the most havoc in the city streets, it was clearly the Nation of Islam. That's why it was targeted to the extent that it was. That's why Muhammad was targeted to the extent that he was. I cannot emphasize this enough. what they learned through that surveillance was the real revolutionary was not Muhammad. In fact, he was sort of the buffer, or he was sort of the what's the word I'm looking for? The counterbalance to the revolutionary impulses of Malcolm X. Malcolm X was the firebrand. Malcolm X was the one that would use the FOI. Elijah Muhammad always refrained. He exercised restraint. He said, "I don't want a war with the LAPD. You know, I don't need these problems." So that's why, through the surveillance of Elijah Muhammad and Nation of Islam, that's how they got clued in on Malcolm X. Garrow continues, the FBI very well may not have understood everything of what they were hearing, but those electronic surveillance logs may be evidence towards identifying who the conspirators behind Malcolm's murder were. And of course, the problem is they've they've withheld a lot of the documents that reveal or might potentially reveal FBI culpability, and in some cases they've blacked out words or blanked out pictures, as you can see here, of people that were involved in important meetings or scenarios around the Nation of Islam, scenarios around the assassination. And so it's made it difficult uh, to try from just using the FBI documents to ascertain who was involved or how it went down. And this is Garrow talking. He's an FBI expert. The 1962 COINTELPRO documents. I don't know. This is interesting how we even found out about it. This wasn't until 75 when the church hearings come out. There'd been a robbery, and during the course of one of these hearings, the documents that were stolen during this robbery of an FBI station, uh, some of them were these COINTELPRO documents. And everybody's like, what's that about? And that's how the public became aware of this program called COINTELPRO. It was because of the result of a robbery, of an FBI station. Anyway, these 1962 COINTELPRO documents from the Internal Security Section of the FBI, which is like the highest level, quote, where the FBI was aiming to publicly embarrass Elijah Muhammad was a classic Bureau tactic. This is according to Garrow. And we see it over and over again. They did it with Martin Luther King constantly, trying to feed stories or leak stories to the media about MLK and his trysts with women or financial improprieties or this or that. They're doing the same thing with Elijah Muhammad. This is how you undercut the credibility of the leader, right? This is what we call rat fucking. Garrow itemizes these two documents in particular. Document number one, according to the document, it says, quote, the Bureau continues to receive information through investigation conducted by Chicago and Phoenix that Elijah Muhammad is engaged in extramarital activities with at least 5 female members of the Nation of Islam. This information indicates Muhammad has fathered some children by these women. These paradoxes in the character of Elijah Muhammad make him extremely vulnerable to criticism by his followers. Remember that whole story when Malcolm X gets approached by one of Elijah Muhammad's kids. He says, "We got to do something about this. Dad's sleeping with all these underage girls. He's got them pregnant. We know the FBI is surveilling. This is going to come out. It's going to be public. We got to have an answer for it." We talked about this in a couple of the earlier episodes. And of course, Malcolm X gets involved. He comes up with the Old Testament prophet excuse. But instead of being thanked for his contributions, trying to defend the leader, they threw him under the bus. Elijah Muhammad included, because he didn't like the intervention. He didn't like being chastised. He didn't like anyone knowing about his misdeeds. And of course, now his number two knows about it. Of course, this was disillusioning to Malcolm X, who was a true believer, to find out that the leader was doing this kind of stuff. Nevertheless, he defended him, tried to. And the whole impetus behind this was that the FBI was surveilling and they were going to leak it. And so they had to have an answer ready. Well, sure enough, they knew all about it. And this document proves it. And they were planning on leaking it. Why? Because according to that last sentence tells it all. These paradoxes in the character of Elijah Muhammad make him extremely vulnerable to criticism by his followers. If we just leak this, uh, the criticism of Elijah Muhammad will do the trick for us. We won't have to worry about Elijah Muhammad going forward because in his own organization, he'll be discredited. That's the whole point of COINTELPRO. And as long as methods like this work, you don't have to resort to other tactics, more extreme tactics like assassination. If you can just discredit him, hey, that's that's good, that's as good as gold as far as they're concerned. Another document he points to is Chicago. It says, quote, Chicago is authorized to prepare and mail an anonymous letter to Clara Muhammad. These letters should be mailed at staggered intervals, using care to prevent any possibility of tracing the mail back to the FBI. It's the same thing they did to Martin Luther King. All these anonymous letters sent to Coretta Scott King. This one's going to be sent to Clara Muhammad to cause problems at home, right? You remember the one that they sent, most infamous letter they sent? This one was actually to Martin Luther King. It was a blackmail letter, right? Here's what we know. Here's what we're going to do with this information. Unless you commit suicide, just kill yourself and this all goes away. Otherwise, your family's going to know about it. This is what the FBI is doing. And the fact that they're doing it with Malcolm X it just adds to the layer of knowledge we already have because we've already done the MLK study, and we know that they were doing the same thing to him. We know that they're doing the same thing to Fred Hampton. This is all FBI tactics. This is COINTELPRO. It's what we call rat fucking. Some people don't like that word, but it describes to a T what it is. Um, Dr. John Fox, again, FBI historian, says the tactics of COINTELPRO were meant to disrupt the abilities of groups to focus and to coordinate activities. And uh, if you go to this first paragraph in the memo on the left, uh, I think it's interesting. They use the word screw. You see the word screw there in capital letters. Uh, and this is sort of what this is a COINTELPRO document, as you can see in the subject area there. And this is what they do. They screw, or I use the word rat fuck, with these organizations to discredit them, to discredit the leaders, to disrupt everything they're trying to do, right? And and the primary means of doing this is through surveillance. And then that gives them a clue how they can specifically target or manipulate or maneuver, push the right, which buttons to push, et cetera, et cetera. They had a million different tactics, right? The strategy was to infiltrate and to discredit the movement and the leader. But they had a million different tactics by which they did this. But it's interesting that it includes assassination. I put that memo in the MLK series. I should have probably put it in this series as well, but just to remind you, to refresh your memory, that we pulled a COINTELPRO document which listed all the different tactics of COINTELPRO, and the last tactic was assassination. So it was included in their little toolkit of all the things that they could do. And this is what is aimed at and targeting Malcolm X uh, at the time of his assassination. And it's been aimed at him since 1960. And what they've realized through their original target, which was Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, was that Malcolm X was the real problem. He was the real threat. He was the one who, if he had influence over Elijah Muhammad, they had to worry about that fruits of Islam. If he didn't, if they could exploit the schism there, eh, maybe they could take two birds out with one stone. And then when Malcolm X went his own way and he got bigger, instead of shriveling up and going away, they realized, okay, it's just like we feared. He's the bigger threat. And if we don't do something now to neutralize him, he's quickly gaining steam as this international figure now. And so you can kind of see how this is morphing from a fear of Elijah Muhammad to a fear of Malcolm X. from a fear of Nation of Islam and the fruits of Islam to more of a fear of the OAAU and Malcolm X's International Coalition of African Countries and American Civil Rights, and especially his merging with Martin Luther King. So that's enough for episode 11. I really just wanted to start exploring this COINTELPRO influence in Malcolm X's organizations, plural, not just the singular, and in his own life, and just how ever present the FBI presence was in Malcolm X's travels and his itinerary. Just like we saw earlier, everywhere he went, the FBI went with him. It, they were symbiotically disjoined at the hip, so to speak. Some of them he knew, like Tony Bauza, but most of them he didn't because they were not uniformed. They were plainclothes infiltrators. All right, that's enough for today. Hope you enjoyed that. Until next time, I hope everybody has a blessed day. Thank you.